Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and this is a special crossover edition of Culturally Determined, featuring Glenn Loury, who all Blogging Heads viewers and listeners probably know. But Glenn, could you introduce yourself, just in case they don't?
I'm Glenn Loury. I'm host of The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. I'm professor at Brown University of the Social Sciences and of Economics, and a colleague of Aryeh Cohen-Wade.
Right. So thanks for agreeing to do this, Glenn. And this is like, when the X-Men would appear in the Avengers or something like that, kind of a crossover thing. So there's some stuff I wanted to talk to you about. And when we made our agenda, other stuff started bubbling up in the news. But let's start with something that you've been talking about a lot over the past 6 months or so on Blogging Heads, which is kind of the affirmative action issue. And I re-listened to some of your talks about it, especially particularly the one you did at Harvard with John McWhorter, where you gave a short presentation about affirmative action. And then, I was always kind of like somewhat ambivalent about affirmative action, seeing like pros and cons. And then this story broke a couple months ago that we've all heard of about the this scandal involving fraud in college admissions. And, it caught up some kind of semi-prominent people. The actress Lori Loughlin and Felicity Huffman were both had paid someone to help their children get into a college that they wouldn't have gotten into otherwise. And the key conduit. So there were two kind of key parts of this fraud. One was sending like an imposter in to take the test, take the SAT or whatever for the student. So that's that's like a standard standard kind of cheating. But then the other was bribing athletics officials at the universities to get a particular student in. And this happened at a number of high-profile colleges, including my alma mater, Yale, where the women's soccer coach was bribed to get a student in, and reportedly like for over $1 million was bribed for this amount. And it reminded me that, there is not just one sort of preference that is given to potential students who are trying to be admitted into college. There's a couple. So there's some sort of racial preference that's kind of vague, but we all know it's there. And then there's kind of these, legacy admissions, or a donor who gives a lot of money. Maybe their kid will get in. Jared Kushner got into Harvard. Like, did he really deserve that spot? Impossible to tell, but his father had given a multi-million-dollar donation. And then, it's well known that if your parents, one or more of your parents went to a college, they give you a leg up in admissions. And then there's the athletes. And, and I think really that's the strangest one, because what is the real purpose of university athletics? Does it have anything to do with university academics? And we've now seen that the system can be gamed through bribery and falsehood. But why should someone who is good at throwing a ball or whatever get a leg up in college admissions and do some of the things that you talked about as, applying to African-American students who get in through some sort of affirmative action? Does that apply to these students? Do they go, like you talked about how it's undignified and, people in the room might suspect them of not being up to snuff.
No one suspected Jared Kushner of not being up to snuff. Well,
maybe they did, but
there's a lot on the table. You say a lot of different things. And I'll get to my reservations about affirmative action in the case of African Americans, but I want to address the general point, the fraud. So huge amounts of money changing hands and people compromising their integrity in a very fundamental way. And it wasn't just that these incidents happened. It was there was a middleman broker who made his whole living setting up these things and had connections at various colleges around the country. This was an industry. And it is a matter of corruption. There's not any doubt about that. So corruption exists. Corruption is not an argument for more corruption. If you thought that affirmative action was somehow problematic, it wouldn't be the fact that there existed these kind of fraudulent activities wouldn't be an argument for affirmative action. But it would be, it seems to me, a couple of things. One thing it would be a clear indication of the value of the discretionary decision that's being made when you decide whom to admit and whom not. People are willing to pay a lot in order to be included. So something really significant is at stake. So that I think this is like a market test of the weight of what's going on when you decide at the margin someone gets in and someone doesn't. That's a really big deal. Hence, if you're Asian and you're living in Southern California in an Asian community, and a lot of people in your community are scoring high on these tests and are not getting in, the stakes for you are very high. So I want to say the stakes are very high. It seems to me that's one thing that it shows. I don't think it shows that the whole thing's a fraud, and the idea of merit is simply a cover for power moves. I don't think it shows that. I do think, though, that there's something in the observation that for some people it's much more salient that they might have been admitted by means other than purely academic merit. For example, African Americans who might come into a cloud of suspicion of not being up to snuff. And for other people, it wouldn't be because they're not subject to the stigma. So I take that point. As far as athletics are concerned, I mean, what is the university? So the university is a community. As far as legacy admissions, the idea of building ties within families, as far as receiving donations, are seats for sale? Well, yeah, sort of, a little bit, because these are philanthropies. You're not going to tell me museums don't take actions with respect to how they curate their collections, or that other kind of philanthropic enterprises don't tailor their operations in part in order to cultivate the kinds of support that they need over the long run. Athletics doesn't contribute directly to the academic mission, but it certainly contributes to the institutional robustness by building the loyalties and so forth and so on. I'm not making an argument for anything. I'm just trying to say it's a complicated industry with all these different things going on. Now, as far as affirmative action for African Americans is concerned, I have one concern and one concern only, which is the large difference in the pre-admission academic qualifications as indexed by the test scores and grades of the students who are being admitted. And my concern is that this correlates with their performance in the institution after the admission. Now, you can tell me either it doesn't matter or it's not true. That is to say, it doesn't matter whether or not they're clustered in the middle or kind of mediocre performance and marginal with a few exceptions. You can say it doesn't matter, or you can say it's not true. That if you admit a large population group with systematically different criteria, much lower cutoff thresholds for evidenced academic mastery before admission, it won't manifest itself in any differences that are worth noting in their post-admissions performance. I don't believe either one of those things. I think it matters, and I think it's true. Now, can I prove it? I'm not going to make some kind of Amy Wax claim here, the woman who said that she'd never met a black student who was in the top of her class. I've met many, many, many outstanding black students in my years teaching in universities. I'm not trying to categorically denigrate African-American students who are in these Ivy League universities. I'm simply asking a question. I'm saying if a 1,400 SAT score is one thing and an 1,100 SAT score is another, do we see those kind of systematic differences by race? Does it matter? I think we do, and I think it does. And what I'm concerned about is, what do we want? Do we want a regime of equality, or do we want a regime of a kind of dispensation where people are accommodated because we know that that's a part of the thing? I'm very concerned that diversity becomes the rationale for the inclusion of African Americans at these exclusive institutions, as if it's the African Americanness that is the qualifying characteristic, not the mastery over the materials that are at hand. So those are my concerns. But as far as the scandal is concerned, the first message it sends to me is, my God, these seats are worth millions of dollars to people, and it really does matter how you give them out. And legitimating the criteria. Okay, so the criteria have to be legitimate. People, this argument has metastasized into, well, we don't want the test. We want to kind of, the New York City exam school case would be a clear illustration of that, where we think that the test is the enemy. And my mind on that is, gosh, the test is a messenger. Now, the test may be imperfect. We can discuss that, but bottom line is there's information to be had about how people have developed their abilities prior to, et cetera. So.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot to respond to. I mean, part of it is there are. This is not just like a series of classrooms where people are sitting and taking exams. There are all these other parts. It's a community. there are sports, there are arts, there are fancy buildings that are always being constructed, and they need more money than just the tuition payments to keep the whole thing going. So my admission to Yale, as far as I know, was not paid for via $1 million, and I wasn't an athlete, so I got in based on, merit. One of my suite mates freshman year was a recruited baseball player, and a guy who lived across the hall was a recruited football player, and another guy who lived across the hall was a recruited squash player. It was clear that like they were kind of there for different reasons than the bulk of the students were there. We called them jocks, and they were recruited for their athletic ability primarily. I assume they had to meet some sort of standard in terms of academics, but it was a lower standard. It was obvious to everyone in the classroom and out of the classroom their behavior. The men's football, the baseball and football teams, they all joined the same frat, which is Deke, which is the same one that Brett Kavanaugh was in also long ago.
I've heard about it.
And they kind of like kept to themselves, and they threw parties and stuff. But it was just, it was not even, I wouldn't call it open secret. Like, you could just tell, any observer could tell that this was like a different thing that was happening here. And then, like, okay, but this isn't just like the football team and everyone loves football and homecoming is an important community event. Like I said, there was a squash player across the hall, and I actually looked at the Yale athletics page to get the list of teams, and there's a lot. So we have baseball, basketball, football for men, in addition golf, ice hockey, lacrosse, co-ed sailing, squash, swimming and diving, heavyweight and lightweight crew. And then for women, there's sailing, fencing, field hockey, gymnastics, ice hockey, sailing. There's both co-ed sailing and just sailing.
These are
volleyball.
Sports where scholarships are given for.
These are varsity sports at Yale. And then in addition, there's like 50, like intramural teams or club teams that, don't get no recruiting, but like the kids just play club soccer or whatever.
Okay. So
that's a lot of students. And one is forced to ask, why does Yale have swimming and diving? Women's ice hockey? Like, is that even a thing? I guess it's an Olympic sport, but like, you can make a case, I think, for, maybe baseball, basketball, football, and then women's equivalent of basketball, softball, field hockey or something, and then like get rid of the rest and
let it be intramural, but don't make it into a whole industry.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have any feelings about that one way or the other. I do, though, think it's interesting, the proliferation of these sports, and it invites conspiracy theory-like speculation that it's a cover for doing something else or a way of bringing a certain type into the university community who otherwise might not qualify.
Well, if you think of
another route, I wonder if this filters back to the prep school culture. I wonder if we did an ethnography of what these kids, when they're 15 years old, are talking about. If they're already, kind of grooming themselves to get on different tracks, because the ultimate goal is a desk at Goldman Sachs.
Right. And the thing, I think I mentioned this before on the show, a weird quirk at Yale was a lot of the jocks were econ majors. And econ,
that is weird, because econ's supposed to be hard. Man.
It's supposed to be hard. Like I never took an econ class, and the reason I heard was that it only required 10 mandatory classes instead of the normal 12 mandatory classes. And then also they all took it together, so they like did the problem sets together and stuff. And yeah, they all wanted to work on Wall Street in the end. So it was kind of a weird thing there. And I heard at one point the stat that 1 in 6 people, undergraduates in every class, are recruits for sports. So that's a lot. Like that changes the tenor of campus. And I was an English major. I wasn't in many classes where like complex equations were happening, but I don't remember times where there was like someone in my seminar or whatever where I was thinking like, oh, that person is a ethnic minority, they're only here, or racial minority, they're only here because of a special preference. Or like I do remember thinking like, this kid is a dumb jock. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just here because he plays lacrosse really well. But even but the other thing that's annoying to the nerdy student is like, they're not even that good. Like the really good ones go to Stanford and Duke, or they go to Ohio State because they want to play professionally.
They're not that good athletes?
Yes. If you're really good at football, you don't go to Yale, you go to Ohio State. So they're mediocre athletes and mediocre students, but they're just whatever track has led them, prep school or whatever, wealthy family,
But I think there was a great football player who was a Yale alum, Calvin Hill. Am I wrong about that?
That's right.
He played for the Dallas Cowboys.
That's right. And there was a player, Ron Darling, was a pitcher for the Mets who came from Yale.
He was at Yale?
Yeah, it happens once every 10 years. There's someone makes it from Yale, but it's just like you can see how this built up, but it's such a weird system.
I was going to just say the question that one might ask then is, does it matter if for African Americans or people of color, black people, brown people, that their presence in the university is partly under the color of some not completely quote unquote meritocratic selection process? Is that anything different from, more egregious than, more reason to be concerned about the phenomenon that you're describing with respect to athletes? And my gut reaction to that is yes, and my reaction is based upon ethnic pride. And this may actually help me identify the reason why my argument isn't compelling to everybody else, which is that I have this kind of vision about what black people ought to represent. Maybe I want us to be a little bit like the Jews. Don't tell anyone I said that. I want a lot of Nobel Prizes. I want people in the physics department. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. I mean, I want. What do I want? They're going to call this respectability politics somewhere. I want achievement, a quote unquote achievement. And that's how I get to equality, and that's how I overcome the stigma. So the stigma is the suspicion that overhangs blacks, but probably doesn't overhang, white athletes who might have gone to a prep school, which is, as a general matter, you guys aren't quite up to stuff. There's something problematic here. Maybe you're not as smart as we are on the average or whatever. And I want to dispel all of that, doubt and suspicion and stereotype. And a lot of people might say, why would you respond in that way? Why are you playing that game? They're saying that you're not smart, and you're going to go and show them that you're smart. Why don't you dismiss that question out of hand? This kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's not good enough that there would be an equivalency between African American beneficial from affirmative action and, let's say, an athlete in a peripheral sport benefiting from it, because I really don't care about the reputation of the athlete, but I care about the quote unquote reputation in the eyes of the system of those of us who are people of color who come into these elite venues. And even as I say it, I begin to have doubts about whether or not that argument can be sustained.
Yeah, and I'm sure. Well, I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that the majority of recruited athletes who graduated from Yale are not staying awake at night saying like, "Am I worthy? Was it really my inner excellence that powered me through this, or not?" Like they're probably totally fine with whatever comes to them later in life. And and no one is like, if your doctor or something was a athlete at an elite college, people aren't going to know that and think like, oh, I don't want an athlete who played squash at Princeton, or I don't want a doctor who played squash at Princeton. Whereas there's this racist trope that you wouldn't want a black doctor because they skated through just because of their race. But yeah, I think it's I don't know. I had a conversation with this guy Robbie Soave who wrote this book called Panic Attack. He's a writer at Reason, and it was about kind of left-wing radicals on campus. And one of the things I brought up is the tuition is going up constantly, and I think this adds to the pressure cooker aspect about campuses. And then it's well, what are they paying this much money for? I actually just saw today that the University of Chicago is going to be $80,000 for undergraduate tuition, and that was the first college to crack that $80,000 mark. What are they getting out of it? Wow. Is it worth all this? And a lot of the time it's subsidized through financial aid or loan forgiveness or something. But what is the point of these massive things that play such an important role in our lives, and they cost so much money, and they judge us whether we're worthy or not, and then they give you a credential for the rest of your life. And is it worth all the so much money to go to instead of doing something else? If someone had said to me, and I think Robbie said this also, the young woman whose parents paid $1 million to get her into Yale, why didn't they just give the daughter $1 million and have her go off and do something interesting with her life? Maybe I would have taken $1 million and said, I'll go to Rutgers instead of...
You've seen the American Express commercial, right? I mean, some things are priceless.
Right.
And it's actually a very good point. I mean, there are some things, everything's not commensurate. There's some stuff that money can't buy,
Right, and we thought that was an Ivy League education was something money can't buy in an explicit sense, but or at least admission. But this scandal showed that because of corruption,
the fact that it's a scandal showed that basically you can't buy it. I mean, you might be able to cheat the system, but you're cheating the system. The structure of the system is that there's an honor which is only really legitimate if it's earned on a criterion other than forking over cash. So I mean, I that's what impresses me very greatly about the fact that people took such risks and went to such elaborate lengths. I mean, if you've got tons of money, maybe a few $100,000 doesn't mean that much to you if you get what you want. But the risk involved is very substantial, as we all know now.
Yeah, and then there was this question of like, if your parents are Felicity Huffman and William H. Macy, like B-list Hollywood celebrities, you'll probably have a fine life, whatever education you get. Do you need to cheat the system to do it, or could you just go to like UCLA instead of USC?
Isn't this bragging rights for parents? Isn't this parents want to be able to tell a narrative about what their kid is doing in life?
Yeah, that's part of it. And the bumper stickers for that say Yale University that my mom put on her car and
yeah.
Okay, before we move topics, do you have anything else on this one you wanna add?
No, not really. I mean, you asked the question in the pre-discussion about class-based affirmative action,
mm-hmm.
and I think it raises the question of what are the criteria for selection into an elite university environment, and this idea of what is merit and all of that, and also what kind of community are you trying to create, and certainly the fact of a very highly stratified system of status reproduction where the people who end up getting into these gatekeeper institutions come vastly predominantly from the upper few percentage of the income distribution and such is not, there's something very problematic about that. I mean, there's some, in some sense unjust about it. That's not the way you want to have your society ordered. So I think a kind of merit-based financial situation where if you're good enough to get in, you should be able to go, and then we'll work out a deal about how we're going to do that is kind of the way to go. Now, do I think that people should get credit in the sense of you got a somewhat lower academic profile, but you're from a lower class family, and so we're going to take you in? I suppose within reason, I don't see any problem with that either. It would invoke some of the same concerns that I have about racial affirmative action, how big is the gap and all of that. The institution has to protect its own interests, right? It's supposed to be elite. Scalia said this in one of those Supreme Court arguments a long time ago. I thought it was a very profound thing. He told the University of Michigan Law School, if you didn't want to be an elite school, you wouldn't have to do an affirmative action. And I thought it was a deep point. That is, they are premised on elitism, which is exclusionary. They're premised on the idea that only the best of the best. And then when there are racial differences in the other criteria, they have to do racial affirmative action because they also want racial diversity, which is fine. But the idea is it's elite. So how much would I compromise that in the interest of class egalitarianism? That becomes don't I still want it? I mean, I still want it to be rarefied. I still want it to be, at some level esoteric and intellectually challenging and, by definition, not something that everybody drawn at random from the population is going to flourish in doing. That's kind of the definition of the enterprise. So those are things I would add on the affirmative action question.
Yeah. Yeah, like, a community college wouldn't have affirmative action, we could assume, because they just let everybody in,
sure.
Pretty much. So, right. I think I think like politically, I'm surprised there has been more push for like Democrats to switch to advocating a class-based system instead of a racial system. Like, it just seems like smarter politics. And I guess there's parts of the base like Black voters maybe would be opposed to that, but it seems like just smarter politics and would maybe do a little something to take down the tensions or the backlash kind of feelings that some like poorer white people feel like that those other groups over there are getting the preferences and we're not getting anything from the government or whatever.
Well, of course, the Democrats are going in the opposite direction with the discussion about reparations.
Mm-hmm.
It would be smarter politics on affirmative action, but it might not be smarter politics across the board because race neutrality and class not race is a kind of anti-identity politics mantra. I mean, the next thing you know, you're going to want me to say all lives matter.
I would never ask you to say that, Glenn. But you see, especially, among the younger left, where more people are coming out of the socialist tradition than the identity politics tradition, there are people who are like, no, class is what really matters. Everything else is this, facade. And so that's kind of like the intramural fight on the left. Okay, why don't we talk about Trump, who, it's impossible not to talk about. So the thing I originally wanted to talk about was, like, does it matter that Trump is a bad person? Like, is this important? Does it matter? Like, he's racist. We all know, is he racist? Is he racist? Whatever. Does it matter? And then I proposed this idea before his latest comments about sending, Ilhan Omar and sending people back to wherever they came from, even though 3 of the 4 women come from the United States. So that is like, I don't know. I think that specific statement and the things he's been doing the past week are really like some of the worst things he's said in his public career. And it's, the thing he said about the judge who was Mexican American, he's like, that guy won't give me a fair shake because I'm Mexican American, or because he's a Mexican American, and I want to build a wall. That was pretty bad, and then I think this one is worse. But also, like, a lot of the, it seems like a lot of people on the right have made their peace with Trump being personally not a good Christian or whatever, and but like, does this matter? In a lot of ways, he kind of is doing the same stuff that if Ted Cruz had been elected, like, a lot of the policies would be the same. Probably the same too. Supreme Court justices would have been nominated. Maybe less emphasis on immigration control, but the same economic policies largely. So like, does the fact that this guy who was obviously a bad person and cheats on his wife with porn stars and Playboy playmates, and it's just this strange, awful person that you wouldn't like put in charge of your 401k or something. Like, it doesn't matter at all that he's the president. And then just the last thing I'll add, there's a podcast. I think what was it called? I think it's called Slow Burn, that Slate put out. That the first season was about Nixon's impeachment, and the second season was about Clinton's impeachment. And I was a teenager during the Clinton impeachment, but it's one of the first like political things that I paid attention to as it was happening in the mid-90s. And they go back and, they're interviewing people. They didn't get to interview Lewinsky, but they interviewed Tripp, and Ken Starr was interviewed, I think. So so it's an interesting podcast. But they talk a lot about Bill Bennett as a major character. And, he was really campaigning against Clinton on these like purely moral grounds. Like, if we let this go, this guy who told an obvious lie, then like, where are we as a society? And then, 20 years later, there's this moral cretin in office, and I haven't heard.
Oh, with the gambling habit and all that kind of stuff.
I haven't heard the like moral outrage from the right. So there's one thing. It's like, oh, it's all just performance. It's all just cynical, like, people are just going to do whatever just to get their side ahead. And, the fact that Clinton was, treated women badly and had an affair, will hit him for that. But if Trump obviously treats women badly and has affairs, like, well, that's fine because he's giving us the judges we want. So, okay, this is kind of rambling, but yeah, do you think it matters that Trump is this amoral or immoral person?
Okay, so it's a provocative question. It's an interesting question. Okay, so how bad is Trump? So is he a racist, quote unquote, and a misogynist, and how does he treat women, and does he steal and swindle his business partners, and is he a traitor to the country? Can he be trusted with the crown jewels of American democracy, and so on? So how bad is, what kind of monster have we put into the White House? As I observed the Never Trump movement, or whatever it is, kind of, I saw Bill Kristol at a dinner not long ago here at Brown, where he came up for an event. And he was, I say with respect, because I admire Bill Kristol as an operative on the right in American politics, a shadow of his former self. Of course, the Weekly Standard had just shuttered, and whatnot. And it's become, and I'm his Twitter confederate, so I see what he's putting up, and he's just one guy, okay, and I don't mean to single him out, except everybody knows who he is. It's pathetic. It's kind of exhausted. It's kind of a sad thing. And what keeps it going? I kept asking myself, what keeps it going? What keeps it going is, the Max Boots of the world we could name names. What keeps it going is just kind of this guy's just so despicable. He's just such a cretin. He's just such a horrible person to be in the White House. It's bad for our country and so forth and so on. And I do see this at some level as an extension of the right-wing Republican revulsion and the moral majority revulsion to Bill Clinton over the Monica Lewinsky thing is a kind of, we got politics going on. We're fighting over huge things like who's on the Supreme Court, and we're winning or we're losing. But we got this guy, and he's in the White House. He's in the Oval Office, and he's doing these awful things. So I don't know what I just said adds up to. I see how it's important to people. I often think it's a silly question when you ask me is Trump a racist. I often think it's almost like trying to decide whether or not somebody is a terrorist or something like that, because it's like we have this moral standard, and we're not going to assign and we're going to judge people who's a racist, who's not a racist. It's a certain kind of card that I'm not especially enamored of playing. And moreover, I worry that it is playing into the president's hands. I mean, let's stipulate that he's a racist, quote unquote, whatever we mean by that. Let's stipulate that he's a bad man, that he doesn't share our values about certain racial questions. I mean, what really matters is who's on the Supreme Court and who's going to win this election coming up in November 2020. And what's the economic policy and what are going to be the foreign policy doctrine? What's going to be our relationship to Western Europe? What is the trade regime going to look like at China in 10 years? And things like this. These are the things that actually matter. So the culture war resentments, I think, that a lot of people who might vote for Trump harbor are easy to tweak. He says he wants to put military gear on the street in Washington, D.C. during the 4th of July, and a lot of people scream about it. And I get it. I mean, I live on the East Coast. I'm in the Northeast here. I get why that's all bad. But, out in America, my guess is a lot of people are wondering, you really don't want to just celebrate the country? Colin Kaepernick wants to take a knee on et cetera. I could go on. You see what I'm getting at? Uh-huh. Reparations? Really? The country is built on plunder? That's your story about America? The backlash, resentment against racialized discourse, and he's playing right into it. So call me a racist if you want. It's almost as if he wants to say, yeah, I'm a racist by your calculation, because everybody's a racist by your calculation. Nancy Pelosi's a racist by your calculation. Joe Biden's a racist by your calculation. I don't want foreigners coming across the border without authorization. You're the one who made that into a racial conversation. You want to play your race cards? I'll play my race cards too, something like that. So you ask me, does it matter that he's a bad person? I'm saying, let's stipulate he's a bad, quote unquote, a bad person. He won't be the first bad person to occupy the White House. Is he the worst? I suppose that's debatable. He's bad. Okay, he's a bad person. Secondly, what work is done politically by calling somebody a bad person? I think it's all about making me feel better than the person that I just called a bad person. There's something almost self-righteous about it. You don't think there are any black racists? You don't think Al Sharpton's a racist? For example, American rhetoric is suffused with racialized white people are bad people. How many categorical dismissals of white males have I heard? How much racism have I heard coming out of the mouth of Ta-Nehisi Coates? Quote unquote racism. Y'all get mad at me if you want to, but I'm just saying the discourse is suffused with contested racial, moral, and ethical claims. Some people think opposition to affirmative action is racist. Some people think affirmative action is racist. So is he a racist? Probably. By some calculation. The Central Park Five. You tried out this thing. In the 1970s, his company was held, I almost want to shrug. I don't even know really what they're talking about. I think it's a kind of, a moral self-congratulation that we engage in around these issues. Anyway, that's what I think. And so my answer is no. I don't think it matters.
Yeah, I don't know where I land. I think he's a despicable person. I think, this thing he's said in the past week, telling four freshman congresswomen who all happen to not be white to go back to where they came from is plainly racist. But like, I feel like there's a sense on the left that like once we get something that's so obviously racist, then we'll just be like, Trump, you are racist, and then like something will happen. Like he'll shrivel, like the Wicked Witch of the West or something. But like we all know it. It's not. We've processed this at this time. Like either you see him as the bad person he is, or you're in denial about it because of whatever reason.
Well, let me try this on you, Aryeh. Suppose he says, "I never mentioned their race. I never said that they were brown or that they were black. I just said that they should go back where they came." Suppose he says something outrageous. I realize it's outrageous.
But he wouldn't. I mean, he would have never said that about a white woman. He would have never said, "Go back where you came from." Our
conclusion that it's racist relies upon the idea that most decent people would have internalized the fact of the minority female status of these people and would have forsworn engaging in certain kind of arguments. Just like I'm not going to bring up a dual loyalty question when I'm talking to somebody about Israel. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know that would be, and I'm not going to do it. And if I do it, a person is going to call me anti-Semitic. Now, there's some theoretical abstract thing where I can say, well, in principle, there could be the possibility of dual loyalty or whatever, but I'm not going to do it. I know I'm not going to do it. I internalize that. If I don't internalize it, I'm quote unquote an anti-Semite. Likewise here. And like I said, I think he knew what he was doing when he did it.
Well, I mean, I have various theories about Trump, and, one of them is like the early stage dementia theory that he doesn't really know what's going on as well as he would have 10 years ago. Kind of, he watches a lot of TV. We know that. He repeats the things he sees on TV, either on Twitter or to his aides, and he'll just like reverse himself. And one day he's saying X and the next day he's saying not X and, whatever. So that's part of it. I mean, another is just like, okay, so he's personally immoral. Like we know, I think we know that. But in terms of politics, I think he's kind of almost like amoral. If there's actually is a difference there, like he doesn't take morality into consideration in any way. It's just like he's doing what he needs to do to like get into the next day, to keep his base supporting him, and to get the people on Fox News to say something good about him. So there's no like moral compass that he has that he is keeping to. It's all like self-interest. And I think it's more, it's like a weird, almost a throwback to like a monarchical rule where it's just like the King Donald is there and he issues his proclamation and everyone scurries around trying to figure out how to implement it. And then maybe tomorrow he forgets about it, or tomorrow he reverses it and everyone scurries around. And I mean, some things are happening, but many things are not really happening. And the parade with the tanks ended up being like the tanks didn't even like roll through. They were like on pieces of wood, on the ground, and like you could look at them through the gate. So it wasn't, the massive show of military force that he envisioned. It was just like this kind of weird thing that caused lots of like Pentagon officials to tear their hair out, and they ended up with a couple like tanks, stationary near the Washington Monument. So then there's just the farcical aspect of it, of like, yeah, this guy who's a clown is the most powerful person in the country. And I throw up my hands at that one and just be like, so, I mean, he's causing a lot of human suffering, especially on the border. But at other terms, it's just like, yeah, this is absurd. This is.
Well, let me ask you a question. Do you think that the crisis at the border is about non-white people not being wanted in the country? In virtue of being non-white.
Well, I think
what's the racial dimension?
Well, I think it's complicated. Obviously, most of the people crossing the border are Hispanic and right now are coming from like Guatemala and Honduras. I think Trump doesn't like people who aren't white. He's okay with foreigners. I mean, he's been married to 2 foreigners, but he doesn't like non-white people, especially non-white people in other countries. And yeah, I mean, there's a kind of, you could say there's kind of like principled anti-immigration policy that one could have of, you need a national border, people come in and undercut the wage labor of lower class Americans, and we need to stop that. That's kind of the case that Mickey Kaus has made for like supporting Trump's immigration policies. And then there's just the the sort of like organizational incompetence angle where they're stuffing all these people into buildings that were not built to house a lot of people. They were like temporary holding facilities. And before it was basically like the Border Patrol would catch someone crossing the border illegally and give them a court date, and then either they would show up for court or they would kind of blend into society and they were never seen again. But if they didn't commit a crime, then this is a giant country. A few more people coming in really matter. But yeah, I think if the masses of people coming across the border were coming from Canada into the Pacific Northwest or something, and they were all white Canadians, I think this would play differently because the average white American is less scared of a white Canadian than of a brown person from Central America.
Well, the average Canadian who's white is speaking English and probably has a post-high school education, so on and so on. Mm-hmm. I take the point. I don't disagree with what you said. I was going to say, though, that I read this piece in the New York Times this morning about European efforts to control the flow of unauthorized migrants. And the headline of the story was Europe and Australia have adopted methods that are not dissimilar to things that the Trump administration is doing or want to do. One of those is having interdicting migrants and having them held and apply for asylum or whatever in third countries. Libya has become such a way station. Another is modulating the degree of rescue effort for distressed vessels in the Mediterranean. So the governments are deciding how much manpower and resources to put into responding to distress calls from these vessels, or whether or not to allow the salvage vessels to put into port. And these are pretty rough things. These are, I can imagine what a detention camp in Libya looks like. It's probably not very pretty. Mm-hmm. So I'm not justifying anything by invoking this. What I'm trying to do is describe, it seems to me, what is an intrinsic problem. You say it's a big country and we can take a few more people. Of course, at some level, that's obviously true. But if I had a flow, and, the flow right now is running over 1 million a year, if I'm not mistaken, if I were to have that flow for 10, 15, 20 years without restraint, it would actually have a big impact on the nature of the country. And it's certainly got to be legitimate to ask whether or not that's a desirable thing, and then to take actions based on our answer to that question. And it can possibly be racist to say I'm not so sure that I want 2 million people or 5 million people every decade or something like that for the foreseeable future coming into the U.S. population for Central America. I don't think that's good for our country. I'm not sure why that is a implausible thing to say. That would be my default position, to be honest with you. My default position would be, no, that's probably not the path forward into the 21st century that America wants to follow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
now refugees is a different matter. People claiming asylum, people seeking, whatever. You do have to have some kind of understanding about, humanitarian and so forth. So, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of the biggest problems that Western countries are going to be dealing with this century, especially if the climate changes and more and more people are trying to move out of the equatorial region. And one of the ironies of it is, more and more it really helps right-wing politics to have poor people from the third world trying to get into first world countries. It seems like Brexit. Brexit wouldn't have happened.
That's one of the main reasons that the European governments are so concerned to control these flows, because they're afraid that it feeds a reactionary domestic politics.
Yeah, and Europe has moved right since the Syrian refugee crisis has happened, and Brexit seems like a reaction to wanting to get out of the EU so that migrants from Africa and the Middle East can't just move there. So it's super complicated. I still think the way, the things we're seeing show that the policy was half baked. They weren't ready to actually deal with this. There's just not physically the space to house all these people. Separating children from their parents or guardians seems totally immoral and crazy to me. And the people who work for the Border Patrol are not there's actually an article that I read that I can link to that was in Politico that was about all the ways that the Border Patrol has been poorly managed since it was created in 2003. which was like a merging of other agencies that existed then when the Homeland Security Department was created. And it's been poorly run pretty much throughout, including through the Obama years. And a lot of the people who work there was they went on like a massive hiring spree to like bulk up this new organization, thinking they needed like 20,000 more people than they actually had. They had like 2,000 when it was created. The idea was like, you're going to be like guarding the border, going after terrorists and drug smugglers and stuff. Like, these people were not intended or equipped to be caring for small children, to be like addressing the like health needs of people packed into small spaces. And there's a lot of crazy stuff about use of force. And there was a serial killer who was a member of the Border Patrol who was caught in the last year. So it's possibly the worst. It's possibly the worst managed federal agency. And it's confronting a legitimate crisis, but it's doing it pretty poorly.
I actually want information here on the separation of children. My understanding was that this is, quote unquote, required if you don't want to release the parents because you're not able to detain the children beyond a certain length of time. So they don't want to release the parents, so the children are separated from the parents. But the alternative would be to not detain the parents as well, which would then create, I'm going to say the word incentive. I come with a child, I'm basically going to not be detained because the child can't be detained, and they can't take the child away from me. And that's a problem, right?
Yeah, I think it's not easy to solve this. But again, I go back to, from like a utilitarian point of view, if you're separating the child from the parents or guardians and you're keeping them in these subpar conditions, instead of like sending them to their aunt who's a U.S. citizen immediately or something, or just letting them stay with the adults who know how to care for them instead of a government bureaucrat. It just seems like they're making a big mistake on like humanitarian grounds.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we talk to this other topic that I had that came to mind from listening to your last conversation with John McWhorter, where you got to talking about some of the people who used to be kind of allied with, and these are kind of like the neoconservatives in the domestic sense, less the Bill Kristol invade Iraq neoconservatives, more the people who were around like Commentary Magazine and the Manhattan Institute and City Journal, and you're discussing some of these people, and you had kind of a personal and professional falling out with some of them, and I was wondering like. So, okay, a lot of these people are essentially, some of them are no longer alive, some of them are very old or at the end of their career. And, like, what, has this sort of part of the conservative movement, like, which as I understand it, was like an intellectual reaction against, like, failed or seemingly failed liberal policies in the 60s and 70s, primarily around, like, urban issues and race. What happened to these people? It seems like they didn't, like Irving Kristol had Bill Kristol and Bill Kristol's still around, but he cared about foreign policy. And, Norman Podhoretz had John Podhoretz, but again, he primarily cared about foreign policy. And then the domestic part seems like it's kind of like faded away. And like Heather McDonald, I guess, is one person who still I maybe fits into this group. I think she's at the Manhattan Institute, but I just feel like no one... Like, Trump doesn't care about this stuff. Does anyone on the right still care about what's happening in these issues? Or are they just like, screw it, we're going to go do our own thing. We don't care about this.
Well, I think it's a big, broad template. It's a lot of different issues that are on the table. So, for example, I would include James Q. Wilson, the political scientist, the late political scientist within this kind of pantheon. His issue was crime and punishment. He had a book in the 1970s called Thinking About Crime, a collection of essays that was influential, in which he argued that there was a swing up in the crime wave through the 60s, which was true, that it was in part a response to bad incentives because people were unlikely to be caught and punished, and that it had deleterious consequences for communities and for law-abiding people, and that policy should be shifted. Policy was shifted. In retrospect, now we call it the era of mass incarceration, and people are apologizing for it. But the 1994 crime bill that everyone is denouncing nowadays in the Democratic Party that Bill Clinton signed into law was that Joe Biden voted for, that Hillary Clinton supported. It was a kind of intellectual godchild of James Q. Wilson. Charles Murray is another person who doesn't fit just automatically into the neoconservative because he's not Jewish. He's not from New York City. And he's a conservative. He's a libertarian. I mean, now that he has reached his full ideological expression, we don't think of Murray as a neoconservative. We think of him more as a paleoconservative. But in the day when he was at the Manhattan Institute writing his book Losing Ground back in the 80s, arguing that we had a war on poverty and poverty won, and that the incentives of the welfare system were all screwed up, and that we actually were producing more misery and more poverty by inducing people into patterns of life that were not self-sustaining. His vision of the world actually prevailed. In the 1996 Omnibus Budget Reconciliation and Welfare Act, whatever it was called, I can't remember exactly what it was called. It has some complicated acronym, but it was welfare reform. Welfare reform eliminated the entitlement. I could go on, but you see what I'm saying. I'm saying I think it's uneven. Nathan Glazer, he was the guy that wrote this book critical of affirmative action. What do you call it? Affirmative discrimination. And it was kind of scandalous on the left, Nathan Glazer, but he also over time evolved into a point where he could kind of write this book, what he called We're All Multiculturalists Now, where he kind of, kind of accepted the idea that identity considerations were going to be a fundamental element, and that he was wrong with Moynihan in that early book from the 60s, Beyond the Melting Pot, to think that African Americans could assimilate into the society in any way similar to the ways that the East European or Southern European immigrants had assimilated, or the Irish had assimilated. So I think it's like, on the ideas front, I think there's some huge victories, I think, quote unquote, victories for the neoconservative domestic policy vision, the kind of vision that was being touted in the Public Interest magazine, not just like in commentary, but, where questions were raised about the efficacy of rehabilitative programs, where questions about urban renewal and all these kind of ambitious interventions in the housing market and all that, questions of this sort were being, I think those policy arguments have stood up pretty well. Someone else I think of from that era, Abigail Thernstrom, whose book, Whose Votes Count, was a criticism of the Voting Rights Act. It was a criticism not of the act, not of addressing the question of poll taxes and such. It was a criticism of the drawing of congressional districts with the intent to ensure a majority of minority voters so that you could elect a person of color to Congress, so gerrymandering on behalf of racial representation. And it had within it, I thought, an idea, and the idea has been completely defeated. And the idea was that we don't want to ground our political representation ideas primarily in terms of race and ethnicity. We have many things that are interest, in terms of our geographic distribution, our class location, our what industries we're involved in, what, where we're pro-life or pro-choice, we're religious, or we're whatever. I mean, there are a lot of things that you can organize politics around, and to make race an essential characteristic of political representation is a mistake. That I take to be the core idea of Abigail Thernstrom's critique. It's been completely repudiated. Completely. So, I think it's a mixed bag. I do think, though, that people didn't reproduce themselves. I mean, with respect, Bill Kristol is no Irving Kristol, and John Podhoretz is no Norman Podhoretz. I mean, with respect to these people, I'm not saying, they're bad people or they're weak or something, but I'm just saying, I'm just saying what I'm saying.
Right. And there's this weird, literal reproduction of some of the neoconservatives, who had children who continued on in their vein. I found out within the last year that I'm related through marriage to Midge Decter.
Oh, are you?
Yes. A cousin's husband, his last name is Decter, and I think he's the nephew of Midge Decter or something. Midge Decter, it was Podhoretz's wife, right?
Yeah, well, Midge Decter was the wife of Norman Podhoretz, and I should say she was an intellectual force in her own right. She was just every bit as much as equal as any woman was going to be.
Okay, so they had literal heirs, but are there contemporary, like, intellectual heirs? Like, it kind of seems like maybe aside from some issues related to like education with charter schools and like the police issue is still a live one. So maybe they won the battles, and so they didn't need like a next generation to keep on fighting. But it kind of seems like the Republicans, the conservative movement, has kind of like given up on a lot of these issues and kind of just see it as like, these are the blue. They're gonna, they're voting blue. We're never gonna get these people. Who cares?
Yeah,
like, let them do their own thing, and we have our own parts of the country.
You don't hear anything about compassionate conservatism of the sort that you heard from George W. Bush back in 2000. And I think the Iraq War probably needs to factor in here. I mean, the neoconservatives were a diverse group, but there was a kind of, a heavy Jewish presence, and there was a lot of concern about Israel, and there was a lot of hawkishness on the foreign policy side. And, those ideas fed into the brain trust that sold that war to us. And in retrospect, it was a historical disaster of monumental proportions. So a lot of people have been discredited as a consequence of that. But I knew a lot of these people. I'm thinking that it might be worthwhile to sit down and try to systematically sort through, kind of a summing up, what has come of all of this,
Yeah, I think it's just like, I don't know, it's the era in which they had influence. I wasn't like a political observer during that time, but it seems like people recognized on both sides that there were like problems in urban areas, problems with urban government, and problems with these kind of race relations that need to be dealt with. And then like the liberals had one idea, and the neoconservatives had like the opposing idea, but they still like kind of had the idea that like it mattered what was happening in cities and inner cities. Whereas now it's like, Trump is a creature of a city, obviously. But like, he doesn't care what happens in the Bronx. He doesn't care what happens. That's anything that doesn't affect him at all.
This sort of scene. It was the 50th anniversary dinner for Commentary magazine. And I think the year was 1995. And they had an event at Harvard, and then they had a dinner at the Hasty Pudding in Harvard Square afterwards. And Norman Podhoretz, of course, was at center stage, Commentary magazine. He had been the editor all those decades. And Midge Decter and Neil Kazadoy, people around Commentary, were present, as well as many people who had written for the magazine over the years, myself being one of them. And Norman made a kind of keynote in which he said, basically, let's retire the concept of neoconservatives. We're all conservatives now. And the neo is not useful. And I entered into a little colloquy with him over that. It was friendly, but it was intense. And I said, no, you can't be telling me that. I mean, I didn't sign up for conservatism. This is Glenn Loury, 1995. What I signed up for was this idea, we're the liberals who've been mugged by reality. We don't believe in magic. We're no longer going along with all of these nostrums. We're hard-headed. We believe in incentives. We know that there are limits, etc. And we want to be realistic, and we want to not lose our heads to some kind of radical chic, whatnot. But we do care about the problem. We're just disagreeing with the liberals about how to solve the problem. To me, the move from neoconservatism to conservatism was not intellectually substantive. It was somehow ethically substantive. It was like saying, I don't know how to solve the problem, and I'm okay with that. Let's move on. Next case. It was a little bit like that. It was let's move on to the Cold War or whatever it might be. Let's because this is not anything that really concerns us. There's nobody to work with on the other side. They hate our guts. They hate America. Let's move on. And I wasn't, at least at that time, ready to accept that. I found that to be deeply problematic. And that was part of my own little personal kind of break with folks. Partly happened because I thought they were too interested in wagging their fingers in the faces of wrong-headed liberals, telling them about how dumb they were, than they were in actually trying to help the people who were at the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Do you see anyone who is someone who's not like in the last stage of their career or retired who carries this banner? Like, would McDonald be one of them?
Well, I mean, Heather is formidable. I mean, I think that has to be conceded. I don't know how she classified herself, but the kind of policy critique that she's offering, for example, her book before last, I think, was called The War on Cops. And it was a post-Ferguson meditation on the deleterious consequences of cracking down on police departments in the interest of Black Lives Matter type concerns, because police were going to basically withdraw from, engaging out of a self-protective act, since they know that nobody's going to support them. And this leads to more crime. That's a classical kind of neoconservative type argument. The most recent book of Heather McDonald's, if I'm not mistaken, is called The Diversity Delusion. And there she's got a wholesale attack on the university's efforts to try to bring about social justice and equity by gender, by race, and so on. And it's very arch. She's smart. She's data-driven. She's acerbic. She's fearless. She I think would be very much fitting within this kind of definition of a certain kind of social critic. But I don't know if she'd call herself a neoconservative. She might just call herself a conservative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, something that's interesting is, you mentioned the Never Trump people, Crystal, Max Boot. I mean, I think a lot of, so there were the Never Trump people who started in like 2015, 2016, and there was that National Review cover package against Trump. And as far as I can tell, the people who have stuck to that banner are more likely the Jewish neoconservative types. And then a lot of other people who didn't like Trump at first kind of have made their peace with him. And now, like, Eric Erickson is one person of Red State. He was anti-Trump at first, and just in the past week or two, something set him off that he was like, yeah, okay, I'm donating money to Trump's reelection. Whereas I think a lot, David Brooks is still against Trump. I think Jonah Goldberg is still against Trump. Who else am I thinking of? Jennifer Rubin. I think there is something about the Jewish conservatives see something in Trump that the non-Jewish conservatives don't see, where the non-Jewish conservatives can make their peace with him, and the Jewish conservatives are like, no, this is, I think Boot formerly renounced his Republican Party affiliation. There is especially Bob Wright has a theory that some of these people are just playing being part of the resistance so they can, get on TV and or get their hawkish foreign policy inserted into the Democratic Party instead of the Republican Party that they used to. And then there are Jewish conservatives who really like Trump because he basically is just giving a blank check to Israel and letting them do whatever he wants and doesn't pressure Israel at all in regards to the Palestinians. Okay. But I don't know. I see more steadfast conservative anti-Trumpism from the Jewish neocons than any other group.
Well, you had on the list of things we might talk about at the start, what would the GOP look like after Trump? And it seems to me that's kind of the question. The Never Trumpers are either marginal footnotes or sub-marginal footnotes in the whole story, it seems to me. Trump wins re-election. The irrelevancy of that whole expression, is just going to be just as clear as day. If he gets defeated, maybe they'll get a little bit of a second win, but I think the air's out of that. But I think the issues, okay, so Steve Bannon. So I'm talking about populism. I'm talking about America first. I'm talking about a kind of robust sense of American nationalism and American national interest. The American people. Who are the American people? How do we define the American people? That it seems to me like that idea is going to be much more prominent in GOP politics. The embrace, I guess maybe it had been going on for some time, but now the kind of total embrace of this religious right, pro-gun kind of red state cultural politics, or pro-religious. I'm struck by, for example, I see people confessing Christian faith on Fox News occasionally. Someone will come on, a guest on one of the shows, and they'll talk about their faith and whatnot. Anyway, I'm rambling. Trump will be here and then he'll be gone. The impact on the Republican Party seems to me that it's going to be long lasting, and I'm groping around to try to characterize. It seems to me that part of it is in the sense of America's role in the world, which is being, it seems to me, oriented much more in terms of a kind of internal self-interest, instrumental, and less in terms of a sort of idealistic post-World War II liberal order over which America presides on behalf of mankind kind of thing. I don't know what happens on the racial front. I mean, we're like this. We're like this on some of these issues. You know.
Yeah, it's strange and very hard to predict. You know, I wouldn't have predicted Trump being elected, so I won't make any predictions about his reelection. But when he goes, perhaps natural causes. You know, he's an older guy, doesn't seem to be in great health, angry all the time. You know, when he goes, it's like. How many people are true Trumpists and how many made a deal with the devil to go along with him? Like, we know Paul Ryan agreed to just like work with him and try to like keep him on the straight and narrow, according to Paul Ryan, but now he's denouncing him. There's some, you know, you see people coming up, younger people. There's this guy, Gertz, who's a representative from Florida, who seems kind of like a mini Trump, a younger guy. There's a couple senators, this guy who just gave a speech that people are angry about, I think his name is Hawley from Missouri, which he denounced like the cosmopolitan elite. But if Trump, you know, let's say Trump has a heart attack tomorrow and Mike Pence becomes president, will the Trumpy aspect of the GOP that he introduced will just kind of fade away and get more towards a George W. Bush-esque policy? Because Pence kind of seems like a George W. Bush light to me. And then what are the voters looking for? Like, you know, they like Trump because he said what other people weren't, and he was part of the political entertainment complex that, you know, everyone is immersed in with reality TV and cable news. And
let me put it this way: I think he's awakened the white identity politics thing, and that won't go back to sleep again. That's not usually the way that I want to talk, because that's what people on the left will always say, and they'll overemphasize it often, in my view. But I think at the end of the day, that's kind of what it comes down to. And that genie doesn't go back in the bottle. Those people come into a sensibility that then becomes a basis around which political identity can be organized. And there's a lot of incentives for people. You've mentioned a few of them. I hadn't known about them, to play to that. So, and especially since the other side, quote unquote, is itself deeply enmeshed in an identity politics frame. I mean, these things seems to me they support each other. I'm not saying white identity politics was created by people of color, but I do think that it's a symbiotic, positively reinforcing interaction across both sides of the thing. So, I don't see that going away, and it does seem like a fault line that'll organize American politics for some time to come.
Yeah, and you can see I think that dynamic is right, and you can see the Democrats are becoming more Trumpian, at least in their like rhetoric and the way they conduct themselves in reaction to Trump, like that Congresswoman Pleb who said like get the motherfucker out at one point, and people were dropping their handkerchiefs about that. But yeah, it's kind of like outrage and using social media to get people riled up. Like it seems like Democrats are learning lessons from that, and I think a good campaign theme for whoever is the Democratic nominee would just be a return to normalcy, because I feel like the majority of the country is tired of the constant craziness and would just like to get back to their regular lives and not pay attention to the news anymore. So that's one way you could go. Just be like, okay, let's just get a boring person like maybe Joe Biden to just, we'll take it down 3 notches, and it's not going to be constant madness and craziness. And then an alternate way would be like, no, we need a bomb thrower, someone who can really take it to Trump and like turn things around, not just like go back to how they were in 2015. So I have no idea which would be more appealing to people.
Yeah, I should probably hang it up here.
Okay.
Aryeh.
Well, thanks, Glenn, for coming on. Special crossover episode of Culturally Determined and the Glenn Show. So people know that your podcast is on Blogging Heads and YouTube and the Blogging Heads podcast feeds, as is this show. So thanks to all of our viewers and listeners, and thank you, Glenn, and we'll see you again next time.
Okay, Aryeh, take care.